I will be talking about a systemization of knowledge, or also maybe a systemization of a lack of knowledge, which we'll get into. All right, so the field of security and privacy has come a long way in its increased consideration of people. In 1975, Salzer and Schroeder mentioned psychological acceptability as one of many factors in information protection. And in 1999, there were 2 empirical studies of usability in security and privacy. And since then, the field has grown to consider many groups of people, finding that security and privacy behaviors might vary by social capital, age, gender, a number of other factors. Even as a talk at USENIX 2024 this year showed weirdness, or Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic country characteristics. And so as these papers continue to grow, to give a rather oversimplified view of the methods for studying security, privacy, and people, there are 2 camps. On one side, there are quantitative methods, which generally study security and privacy and people through numbers. How many people use 2FA, for example, or how does age correlate with 2FA use? And on the other hand, there are also qualitative methods, which generally study security and people through words. What mental models do people have about 2FA, or where do these models come from, for example? And you don't need me to tell you that there are many strengths and weaknesses of either, and each are suited to answering different kinds of questions. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on the quantitative, which has historically been the focus of a lot of security and privacy research. And these quantitative studies of security and privacy behavior are increasingly looking at sociodemographic factors for their impact on security and privacy. These factors are often thought of as static, but in reality, they are often dynamic. Age changes every year or every minute, depending on how precise you're counting. They're also contextual, such as race, in the way that race is seen in the US. And so prior work has explored many of these factors and found suggestions that many of these factors are connected to security and privacy behaviors. So in this work, towards getting a better understanding of the relationships between security behaviors and sociodemographic factors, our first goal was to synthesize what is currently known. And secondly, what we do not yet know. And finally, where do we make progress from here? What guidelines and how do we continue to do future research on this project and in this topic? So I'm going to talk about 2 parts to answer these questions. First, a literature review, and second, a case study and some guidelines to shape future research. Starting with the literature review, there are many, many, many papers about security, privacy, and people, so we scoped our study to quantitative studies of actual security and privacy behaviors. Therefore, we excluded studies that looked at hypothetical or intended behavior, concerns, knowledge, or attitudes, just to scope it to a manageable size. And we were also most interested in work that made comparative claims about sociodemographics, so we looked at studies that looked at behaviors between 2 or more groups and compared them. We collected papers from 4 top security conferences, USENIX Security, IEEE S&P, CCS, and NDSS, as well as 3 top security and HCI conferences, SOUPS, CHI, and CSCW. And looking at these scoping criteria that I just mentioned, we found a final data set of 47 papers, which have been published in the last 25 years. So what trends did we observe? I'm going to show these trends organized by sociodemographic factor and also show how many papers studied that factor and some overall trends we observed. And the most studied factor that we found was gender in 38 out of 47 papers. And the overall trend that we observed was that women seem to focus more on information protection behaviors, while men seem to focus more on technical security behaviors. The second most studied factor was age in 30 out of 47 papers, that older users seem to exhibit more security-related behaviors, while younger users seem to focus more on privacy. Education was the third most studied factor, and this was interesting. We did not seem to find any clear trends with respect to education and security behaviors. There were essentially a lot of contradicting results, and so no clear trend that we could find. And there are a number of other factors that I won't have time to go into here, but please take a look at the paper for the full details. Now, I want to draw your attention to this first trend, that women seem to focus more on information protection behaviors, and men seem to focus more on technical security. Just take a second and consider for yourself, why do you think this exists? Hold that thought. All right, I'll move on to the second part of the results, which is about what gaps remain. And some of these gaps you might be more familiar with, or you might expect them, that there are certain groups that are underrepresented in research, for example, non-binary genders or transgender people, that there's a understudied population, many understudied populations that are non-Western. And we, as I mentioned before, with education, found many unresolved contradictions in these findings. And one final gap that we saw was an over-reliance on self-reporting methods. It's very possible that self-reporting methods could impact some of the differences that I mentioned earlier. Could this be why there are gender differences, that there might be gender differences in who is more likely to report or who is more likely or less likely to report different security and behaviors? And one thing I'll say is that self-report methods have well-known biases in security and privacy research. They are not perfect approximation of security and privacy behavior, but they're a great first start. So I talked a little bit about the literature review, and next I'm going to talk about the case study and guidelines. So as I mentioned, this gap from the literature review was self-report, and to get around this issue in our case study, we present a measurement study of Facebook users' actual behavior. Specifically, we analyzed the de-identified aggregated log data of over 16,000 Facebook users and their real security and privacy behaviors. In this study, the dependent variables of interest were 4 security behaviors that were logged relating to settings and authentication. And we also had a number of independent variables, 6 sociodemographic factors and 4 platform characteristics. In our full paper, we also describe 5 guidelines that researchers, perhaps some of you, can follow for doing quantitative work on studying sociodemographics and behaviors, but I'll just mention 2 with respect to our case study for now. First, to identify the factors of interest, especially if they're sociodemographic, in the beginning, to avoid a phenomenon I like to call the sociodemographics jump scare, where sociodemographic factors are not mentioned as an interest in the beginning of the study, but only come up in the results. And also with respect to factor selection, make sure to, if you are interested in that sociodemographic factor, report null results, which I will do on the next slide. And second, a second guideline is to consider which groups are included or excluded in your research. And as researchers, we don't always have a choice, depending on the data set, depending on what we have access to, but we can be clear about those limitations. And so in ours, one of our limitations was that we only looked at binary gender. All right, so looking in this case study at this aggregated log data, with respect to the gender differences, we found that women were more likely than men to make changes to security settings. And this seems to agree with the literature review results, that if we consider security settings as one way of protecting information, this seems to align. Although we did not find differences in password strength or different 2FA use according to gender. So bringing back this why question, these results still really don't tell us why. We don't have an underlying reason for how people are behaving differently in this case. And this is one of the guidelines as well, results interpretation, that correlation is not causation. And so we need to pose multiple interpretations for observed differences that we find. This work identifies a missing why in work, because there could be a number of reasons for gender differences as well as other kinds of differences. Specifically for the gender differences that I have been using as an example, it could be that men are more encouraged to learn about computing, or maybe it's that men are more logical and thus better at using technology. Is it that women are given individual responsibility to protect themselves, or is it that women's emotions somehow make them more gullible? I see a number of different reactions to these different types of theories, and there are many other ones as well. And these all fall under different social theories or different understandings of how the world works. For example, social constructionism, that society is constructed in a way that there are expectations about people with different genders. There are also other theories of biological essentialism, that people are inherently certain ways because of their biology. And so this why question is really important, because without understanding why, we won't know if any of our designed interventions are beneficial. We risk perpetuating stereotypes and essentializing people based on their characteristics. And it's also very hard to engage intersectionality. People don't have one identity, and without understanding why, it's hard to piece together the connections in sociodemographic factors with respect to intersectionality and dig deeper into how multiple factors interrelate. So conventionally, we tend to think of sociodemographic factors in isolation. But the reality is that these factors exist in the context. We exist in the context of all in which we live and all that came before us. And if we are critical, we can see the connections between the factors and the broader societal structures in which we exist. So 2 quick suggestions towards answering this why question. First, to consider an epistemically diverse set of methods. I don't want to say, and in any way, I hope you don't take away that quantitative methods are not useful. They are very useful, and correlations are still a great starting point, but they don't answer all of the questions that we might have as researchers. And so there are other methods, qualitative methods, other quantitative methods that might have more causal power. All of these are different things that we can explore as researchers. And second, we can also engage social theories. And social theories are able to pose richer explanations rather than just mere descriptions without stereotyping people based on their characteristics. If differences are not found, social theories also provide a framework for understanding those results. And social theory is a concept that has existed across many fields, existed far longer than computer security, and they can also highlight understudied sections, intersections of security and social or human factors. Thank you so much for listening. I'm very apologetic that I have to run for my flight right after this, so I will take a couple of questions, and if you don't get a question, please feel free to email me afterwards. Thank you.